Hello. Welcome to Lecture 4 in the Linguistic Anthropology course, developed by Language Lab. The lecture is titled, How Humans Discovered Language. In this session, we shall journey back in time to witness the most momentous discovery in human history, the emergence of symbolic thinking and language. But before delving into this central theme, let us briefly review the key conclusions from our previous session. 1. The emergence of language, consciousness, abstract reasoning, self-awareness, and other qualities considered uniquely human resulted from a disruptive, anomalous event in evolution. 2. This event occurred internally, within the neural architecture of Homo sapiens, and was not triggered by external environmental pressures. 3. The pivotal moment was the formation of mirror neuronal structures, driven by increased brain density during the process of encephalization. 4. These mirror neurons initially represented a pathological development, rendering early humans dysfunctional and placing them at high evolutionary risk. 5. The solution to this crisis was the emergence of symbolic thinking and language. However, this solution did not arise spontaneously, it required a confluence of highly specific circumstances. Our current session is devoted to examining this last point in detail. How precisely did our ancestors discover language? We shall explore the topic itself directly, and subsequently examine the broader phenomena surrounding it. The current mainstream perspective maintains that language in humans evolved gradually through the cumulative co-evolution of multiple components and systems necessary for its emergence and functioning, and which typically identifies its main trigger as the utility of language as a tool for communication. In contrast, we will argue that the discovery of language occurred rapidly, accidentally, and was primarily triggered by the need of the Homo sapiens species to neutralize a neurocognitive disorder. Within this theoretical framework, language is thought to have been invented approximately 60,000 to 50,000 years ago, possibly over the course of no more than 3 generations, within a small and isolated group of individuals, most probably one of the last surviving pockets of Homo sapiens at the height of the species population bottleneck. The latter thesis is supported by contemporary genetic research, which indicates that the entire modern human population descends from a remarkably small founding group originating from Africa. As geneticist Spencer Wells notes, all humans alive today are descended from a small group of people who lived in Africa around 60,000 years ago. We are all incredibly closely related, more than we often care to admit. As also geneticist Brenna Henn and her colleagues observe, all contemporary human genomes are remarkably similar and share a recent common ancestry, which is consistent with a single origin of modern humans in Africa and a subsequent global expansion. It is widely acknowledged in evolutionary biology that genetic drifts, i.e., small, isolated populations, play an especially important role in the emergence of new species. According to the present theory, the isolated group of Homo sapiens that invented language gave rise to a new species, or more precisely a new subspecies, through the very act of inventing language. Indeed, there is a long-standing tradition in anthropology that classifies modern humans as a subspecies of Homo sapiens, designated as Homo sapiens sapiens. Within the present theoretical framework, it is believed that the isolation of this group led to a rare and significant mutation enabling the emergence of language. We suggest that this mutation primarily affected the FOXP2 gene, allowing these individuals to produce and retain a far broader repertoire of vocal communication signals than is possible in any other animal species. What follows is a tentative reconstruction of events, and one that invites the imaginative engagement of the audience. Imagine for a moment an early human from this small, isolated group, one who had undergone a mutation in the FOXP2 gene, pausing to observe a tree. The visual image of the tree is formed in his mind. But instead of manifesting as a dispositional representation, that is, a bodily state inclined toward a physical reaction such as indifference, the impulse to search the tree for fruit, the desire to approach and lean against it, etc., the image, resulting from the full spectrum of sensory information, becomes arrested within the individual's perceiving mind. It begins to replicate there, echoing within the mind through the recursive activity of mirror neurons. How might this individual have felt? This internal repetition feels invasive, almost infectious. It likely begins as disgust, but when attempts to expel the image through gestures fail, panic sets in. In mammalian neurobiology, the panic system is activated when young animals are separated from their caregivers, triggering distress vocalizations. As the neuroscientist Jack Panksepp explains, the panic system mediates the psychic pain of separation distress, a system deeply rooted in the mammalian brain and essential for social bonding. These cries, known in scientific literature as distress calls, are more commonly referred to as crying or sobbing. Though accompanied by acute emotional suffering, their evolutionary function is pragmatic, to signal the need for rescue and reconnection. We all recognize this mechanism. A lost child in an airport, for example, may cry out loudly, not as a calculated decision, but as a biologically driven response aimed at summoning help. The behavior is deeply emotional, yet fundamentally communicative. Faced with panic, the most logical response available to our early human who was overwhelmed by the mental image of a tree was to vocalize it. We may assume that this vocal expression of panic functioned in a double role. First, as a plea for the mental image of the tree, trapped in his mind, to be expelled through the act of shouting and to rejoin the actual tree in the external world, reclaiming its rightful place within the order of perceived reality. And second, it was a desperate cry addressed to reality itself, conceived in this context as a caregiver, whom the individual implored to return to normalcy and coherence. Yet, the relief brought by vocalization was very short. The sound wave produced by the individual was immediately registered by his own auditory system, becoming yet another external object of perception. The mental image of the sound began to regress alongside that of the tree, compounding the internal confusion. Granted a bit of imaginative license, we might picture the individual collapsing to the ground, clasping his head in utter desperation, swaying from side to side, and repeatedly voicing his bitter cries. What else could he do? These attempts to externalize his mental imagery through panic-driven vocalization offered, if nothing else, momentary glimpses of relief. But then, something new happened. Another individual happened to pass by the same tree. He too took notice of the tree, and the tree's image also became locked in his mind, an experience that was equally unsettling. At the same time, this second individual heard the emotional lament of the first one, directed at the very same tree, now a source of torment for them both. In that vocal expression of distress that he heard, the second individual recognized his own confused mental state. In response, he echoed the cry, reproducing its prosody and emotional tone of what he heard. Now, why did he do that? As the renowned primatologist Franz de Waal notes, emotional contagion, the most basic form of empathy, triggers a matching affective state across individuals and is present in many primates. Similar findings by Hatfield et al. And Panksepp and Larvis confirm that this phenomenon operates across species via mimicry, vocalization, and neural resonance. As Panksepp and Larvis observe, the emotional resonance that arises from witnessing the distress of another may not only induce similar affective states, but also activate ancient brain systems that evolved to promote social bonding and communal survival. The phenomenon of emotional contagion within groups is well established in scientific literature. It is by no means unique to humans. Its manifestations have been extensively documented across a wide range of animal species and arguably extend even beyond the boundaries of the animal kingdom. Some researchers suggest that collective vocalizations function as ritualized affirmations of allegiance to one's group, reinforcing social cohesion and group identity. Such group vocal behaviors are observed among a range of species, including various birds, wolves, and gibbons. While the specific functions of these vocalizations vary across species, their underlying principle appears consistent. They serve to foster a sense of unity while also distinguishing members of the in-group from those considered outsiders. Philologist Yuri Monich states that the ritualization of behavior in the animal world, including humans, serves as a mechanism that ensures stability and predictability in interactions, forming the foundation for the development of complex communicative systems. He takes this idea further, proposing that the drive to transmit information is a universal property of living matter, as is the impulse to form cohesive social units. According to Monich, the social processes that preceded the emergence of linguistic systems bear a distant analogy to coassovation, the spontaneous aggregation of organic molecules, which some scientists regard as one of the earliest steps in the origin of life. We return to our reconstruction. Now, two individuals stand by the tree, both haunted by its image and echoing each other's distress vocalizations. This echo becomes a turning point. Consider the sound wave produced by each individual. It is now reflected not inward, into the mind, but outward, creating a copy of itself in the external world rather than within internal perception. The mental image of the tree, charged with the emotion of panic, ceases to be perceived by either individual as a subjective image within their minds. Instead, it is now experienced as an addition to the real, objectively existing tree, as if it had merged with the tree itself in the external world. Thanks to this addition, the tree comes to be perceived by both individuals as no longer being processed within their own minds, but rather as being perceived by a third entity, what we might call the mind of reality. The image of the tree begins to regress in this external perceptual space, relieving both individuals of their cognitive burden and freeing their minds from dysfunction. And so, before us, unfolds the birth of the first word, the moment when sound and shared meaning entered into existence as one. The feeling was magical. Something greater than the individuals, something external, transcendent, has revealed itself through their communal effort, liberating them from mental suffering and the looming threat of psychic dissolution. This communal experience was clearly more rewarding than a series of isolated cries or physical gestures, not least because it alleviated the pain of internal regression for significantly longer periods. It must not have taken long for our ancestors to discover that introducing brief temporal gaps between one individual's vocalization and another's echo enhanced this effect. During this interval, both individuals could fully savor the sense of liberation from regression, anticipating the external confirmation of their projected image through the returned echo. This gap, the waiting for the echo time, becomes psychologically and culturally significant. It marks the emergence of temporal structure in communication, a rhythm that stabilizes emotional exchange. This is also where silence begins to acquire sacred weight. As conversation analyst and sociologist Tanya Stivers and her colleagues note in their cross-linguistic study, even slight delays in response can be interpreted as socially meaningful, revealing that the human brain is finely attuned to sub-second timing in conversation. Linguistic anthropologist Stephen Levinson adds that this micro-temporal coordination is not just biologically rooted, but culturally elaborated. Turn-taking is a universal infrastructure for language use, providing the basis for the temporal organization of interaction. Silence is no longer a void, but a pregnant interval, a ritualized space between emotional acts. It is here, perhaps, that we first glimpse the aesthetic power of pause, culminating centuries later in Shakespeare's resonant phrase, "The rest is silence." From those early times to the present day, human beings live in a constant expectation that their spoken words will be heard and echoed by another, in conversation. This is not merely a metaphor. Scientific research has demonstrated the devastating psychological consequences of social isolation. Prolonged cases of solitude end up in irreparable mental damage. Since those earliest exchanges, our brains have had a long time to practice waiting for an echo to our own utterances, and to train themselves to endure long pauses. Though we have made considerable progress, this capacity still proves to be markedly limited. The romanticized narrative of Robinson Crusoe, single-handedly rebuilding civilization in isolation, is far from reality. The real-life figure upon whom Defoe based his novel, the sailor Alexander Selkirk, who spent no less than 4 years on an uninhabited island in the Pacific, never truly reintegrated into social life after his return. According to contemporary accounts, after his rescue, Selkirk remained withdrawn and taciturn, living out his days in solitude in the remote Scottish countryside, where, according to some sources, he even took up residence in a cave at one point. And the caves become our next topic. Particularly during the Paleolithic period, and especially between 70,000 and 12,000 years ago, humans retreat increasingly into deep, dark caves. This retreat occurred despite the numerous disadvantages such environments presented. The presence of dangerous predators such as bears, lions, and saber-toothed cats, who often competed for these shelters, along with the dampness, absence of light, and stagnant air. And yet, it was in these very places that early humans began to create art. As paleoanthropologist Patrick Payolet observes, whatever the reasons that motivated the appropriation of underground environments, it is clear that making an artistic gesture in deep caves is an original act, almost abnormal or against nature. The familiar image of early humans sitting comfortably around a fire near the mouth of a cave, explained in modern accounts primarily in terms of shelter from weather and animals, may be misleading. Even as far back as 400,000 years ago, hominins who predated Homo sapiens were capable of constructing dwellings. It is unlikely that the cave was chosen solely for practical shelter. Within our theoretical framework, we posit that caves were selected by early humans specifically for their deep, echo-producing galleries. In such spaces, a response to a vocalization externalizing a tormenting mental image could be obtained at any time, even in the absence of other individuals. Caves thus offered not so much physical as psychological shelter. What happens when one is alone, afflicted again by an intrusive mental image, with no one nearby to echo his cry? What happens if the tree, or some other object, pollutes my perception with a mental image again, and at that point there will be no one around to heal my mind through communal chanting? The natural choice of resonant cave vaults then becomes understandable. If I have a cave, I can always retreat there, and even on my own, ensure that the mental image externalized through symbolic vocalization remains outside of me via its echo. There, I can vocalize into the space itself, relying on natural reverberation to simulate the echo of another. The symbolic discharge thus becomes possible, even in solitude. By experimenting with echo timing, sound intensity, and reverberation patterns, our ancestors trained the brain to tolerate longer intervals between utterance and echo, thus increasing emotional resilience. Today, a specialized subfield of paleoanthropology, acoustic archaeology, investigates how natural resonance, echo, and reverberation in these spaces may have influenced, or even been purposefully integrated into ritual practices, performances, or the creation of visual imagery. As audio engineer Barry Blesser and cultural anthropologist Linda Ruth Salter write, reverberation is not just an acoustic event, it is a psychological experience. It alters our sense of space, of time, and even of self. Researchers in archaeoacoustics, Resnikoff and Dauvoir, have similarly noted that prehistoric peoples may have deliberately sought out echo-rich locations not for shelter, but for their emotional and cognitive resonance, suggesting that sonic environments may have shaped ritual behavior and even contributed to the emergence of symbolic thought. I can do this to my heart's desire in a cave, experimenting with sound parameters and the timing of the echo, with the number of its reverberations, thus training my neural circuits for longer and longer pauses between the sound produced and its return. The next time I am outside the cave, I can be confident that I will endure longer without external perceptions collapsing inward, because I will continue to expect the echo of a sound I had just vocalized in the cave in relation to a given object, having trained myself to wait for that echo. This anticipated echo will serve as a symbolic anchor, pinning the object to external reality and preventing it from once again intruding into my mental space unmediated. The only problem I face in the cave is the absence of the referent, that is, of the physical object that engendered the tormenting mental image. Yet in order to externalize this image effectively, the vocal symbol must remain anchored, during the process of externalization, to the physical object that first triggered the perception. What then can be done? The most obvious solution is to recreate the original object within the cave, by representing its image on the cave wall. Once a name was found for an object of the world in the open air, it could be practiced alone inside the caves. In order to have an object symbolized before the eyes, the individual objectified it on the cave wall, at first, with a scratch, an incision, a point, or a cupule. Alternatively, a simple imprint of one's hand on the cave wall could fulfill the same function. These initial primitive marks gradually evolved into more naturalistic forms, eventually depicting animals as symbols of an aggregated collective imagery. In this context, living at the cave's mouth may have been akin to residing on the threshold of a sacred acoustic space, something more like the porch of a cathedral than a simple refuge. Once again, we return to our reconstruction. Both individuals left the tree with a profound, positive experience of discovering a promising method for addressing their neuronal dysfunction. This experience was subsequently replicated as a best practice by all the group, leading to quick epigenetic changes in this population and determining future selection in the configuration of their FOXP2 gene. Soon, numerous individuals congregated around an object that likely captivated their collective attention, collaboratively devising a name for it through a shared ritual of emotional expression and synchronized vocalization. The emotion expressed collectively was no longer limited to panic or distress. After the first successful vocalization, subsequent attempts were likely accompanied by more complex and individually varied emotions. Yet these diverse emotional responses were still expected to converge into a single, shared emotional state, expressed through a common sound directed at a specific object. In this way, distinct vocal symbols began to emerge for objects that made a strong impression on the group, gradually leading to the standardization of names. We might think of these early group efforts as primitive symposiums, gatherings in which a range of emotional responses, and thus alternative meanings, were refined into a unified expression. The word symposium in ancient Greece referred to a social gathering in which communal bonding was fostered through shared eating, drinking, appreciation of the arts, and intellectual conversation. In Plato's dialogues, symposia are depicted as settings where truth is pursued and revealed through philosophical discourse. In the prehistoric symposiums, multiple individual meanings, comprised of bodily states and potential physical reactions to a stimulus, which we may broadly equate with intentionality, were reconciled into a single, commonly accepted vocalization. This vocalization conveyed a dominant emotion, and came to represent the meaning of the object, which in essence was a form of shared intentionality. This unified meaning became the seed of what we now understand as truth. This model challenges the notion that early humans sought truth in the modern, propositional sense. Instead, truth was what resonated emotionally and communally. The synchronization of feeling around a symbol became the marker of shared reality. As the sociologist Emil Durkheim observed, what makes a collective idea sacred is not its content, but the emotion it arouses in the group. Similarly, the developmental psychologist Michael Tomasello emphasizes that shared intentionality, the foundation of human culture, emerges from joint attention and effective alignment. The sociologist Irving Goffman likewise showed that social reality is upheld by ritual alignment, where individuals perform symbolic roles in synchrony with the expectations of others. Finally, as the social psychologist Gustave Le Bon put it, the masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error, if error seduces them. Numerous instances of mass madness, the well-studied phenomenon of crowd psychology, and historical examples of entire societies succumbing to bizarre beliefs and illusions are, within this framework, not aberrations but the most natural and logical effects of language use. They are not outliers, but echoes of the same mechanism that once produced the stabilization of early symbolic culture, and are fundamentally rooted in the drive to synchronize emotional states among communicants. The first symposiums were not only the first conversations, but also the earliest forms of argument in the pursuit of truth. At their earliest stage, they likely resembled a cacophony or disheveled chorus of overlapping vocalizations erupting from all directions. Every vocalization carried a complex emotional charge, which, unlike a straightforward simple emotion of panic and grief in the beginning, could not be directly felt or understood by others precisely, but for which the group yet all attempted to find a common frequency. Consequently, each voice in the symposium sought not only to echo the initial utterance, but also to subtly reshape it, to bend it toward the prosodic contours of the speaker's own emotional nuance. These were, in essence, the first collective attempts to arrive at objective truth, to stabilize meaning beyond the boundaries of individual minds. The insight we gain from our framework is that the agreed-upon truth is more about the synchronization of emotional states among humans than about reflecting reality with clinical objectivity. Yet, many truths present themselves as a combination of emotional synchronization and practical engagement with the object in a given context. This fact obscures the fundamental and primary role of emotions in the entire process. We now return to our reconstruction. The practice of communally externalizing surplus mental images continued to grow exponentially, as it provided increasing ease to the participants' psyches. The more individuals participated in this practice, and the more frequently they engaged in it, the more pronounced its benefits became, exemplifying a form of the network effect. Within this system, anyone could offer immediate relief to a fellow group member. This was done by echoing the mental image evoked by a common vocalization for a well-known object, one that already had a name. Specific names, assigned to specific objects and bearing a meaning common to the group, were well remembered by all. The retention of these names allowed for immediate relief from psychological regression, especially if the waiting period for the echo expired and the object began to re-enter the psyche. It was sufficient to find another individual for a brief vocal exchange, or to retreat into a deep cave gallery, to receive the echo of one's vocalization, and re-objectify the image by restoring it to the object. This act may have been accompanied by creating a symbol of the object on the cave wall, or by using one previously inscribed there. The communal lifestyle of Homo sapiens facilitated rapid exchanges, and the consistent dissemination of symbolic meanings similar for all members. The mental regression was then conceived as occurring within the external object's mind, as a result of the object's interaction with its name. In this way, objects were animated by names as if acquiring their own identity and will. This important aspect of the newly discovered method for objectifying one's mental images needs to be examined in greater detail. When we say that a symbol becomes attached to an object or pins it down to external reality, we mean that once the emotion used to externalize the object's image is shared, it comes to be perceived by everyone as if the emotion now belongs to the object itself. In other words, the emotional charge is no longer experienced as internal and subjective, but as something emanating from, or residing in, the object due to the symbolic aspect, the name, that the object acquired. This is not a metaphor, it's a neurophenomenological shift. The object now carries the emotion. It becomes not just a stimulus but an agent, a shared intentionality that evokes the same behavioral orientation in everyone. As philosopher John Searle observes, social reality emerges when we impose functions on objects, by collectively recognizing them as having those functions. The tree, from our reconstruction for instance, may now evoke panic overcome. It has become a symbolic resolution site, because of emotional memory. Developmental psychologist Michael Tomasello similarly argues that shared agency arises from joint attention and mutual affective engagement, a we intentionality, that allows individuals to treat something as meaningful together. Our hypothetical tree may have been the first sacred object, not through doctrine, but through emotional history. Objects marked by a collective resolution of distress acquired external intentionality, which belonged to no single individual, but were shared by all. The object that receives a commonly recognized name is no longer just a visual stimulus, but a trigger of a common emotional and behavioral response. It becomes the locus of a shared readiness to act, a coordinated affective and physical disposition that the object, through its symbolic anchoring, instills in each member of the group. The tree acquired its own intentionality, an intentionality that belonged to no single individual within the community, but emerged as a shared, externalized orientation. Other objects or a combination of objects imposed on the individuals their own intentionality. We witness the birth of culture. If in a culture, a symbol and its meaning, understood as the emotional state it expresses, and which is communally attached to an object, are not recognized by someone or are ignored, the object becomes unrestrained by the symbol. It is no longer mediated by the shared emotional framework, and reverts to its raw, unprocessed state. In such a case, the object forces its way into the mind of the individual, forming an intrusive mental image that resumes the old cycle of regression, once again afflicting the individual with internal turmoil and triggering the onset of mental illness. Thus, the preservation of sanity requires humans to yield both to the nourishing wisdom and to the oppressive demands of culture. But what happens when the emotional state embedded in the name of an object ceases to be an appropriate response to that object in a given situation? We may perceive an object differently over time, or the object itself may change, acquiring new functions in a different context. In such cases, the original name must be reconstituted through a new symposium, a renewed collective act of communal vocalization aimed at reshaping the emotional associations attached to the object within a new context. New vocal symbols must be uttered alongside the initial name, which now functions as the subject, in order to modify, complement, or reframe the emotional content it carries, that is, to predicate new meaning. Rather than simply saying leopard, one might now say small leopard, or leopard there. Or to the leopard, or distinguish large leopards and small leopards, or state, the leopard goes away. Each of these expansions reflects a specific emotional and situational nuance, expressed and negotiated communally in a new symposium. A new intentionality is being formed around the newly constituted fragment of reality. In essence, a new collective emotion is sought constantly as a synchronized affective stance toward the object in context. This, fundamentally, is the ultimate aim of all human communication, to construct a meaning that evokes a shared emotional state among participants. The process described above represents the earliest form of syntactic organization. The original name functions as the subject, and the added symbols become predicates, adjusting emotional meaning and guiding collective response. What emerges here is not just vocabulary, but structure, the capacity to relate multiple symbolic elements to a single referent and modify its intentionality. This structure is still emotionally driven, but its complexity begins to approximate linguistic grammar. As linguist Derek Bickerton proposes, proto-language likely consisted of isolated symbols that were eventually strung together to reflect more complex states, what he calls a proto-linguistic syntax. The language evolution theorist James Herford adds that the leap to syntactic binding was not merely cognitive, but social. The combination of meanings depends on a shared understanding of how symbols relate in a communicative event. Linguists Bernd Heine and Tanya Kuteva further show that grammatical markers often originate from emotional or interactional words, following predictable pathways that lead from concrete content to abstract function. None of the above would have been possible without a specific genetic mutation in humans, which, as previously noted, is believed to have affected the FOXP2 gene. Without this mutation, it is plausible that humans would have continued to produce only sporadic and limited artistic expressions, similar to those observed from around 100,000 years ago up to the onset of the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, without making the cognitive leap toward fully developed symbolic communication. By this, we mean that such individuals may have attempted to objectify mental images through physical bodily movements, or by producing material representations of their mental states, in order to externalize them, for example, by carving continuous notches on bones. However, because these symbols could not be easily and reliably replicated or echoed by others, they would have ultimately regressed inward again, reabsorbed by the perceiving mind. In other words, the artistic method of externalizing internal images was not sufficient to neutralize the underlying mental dysfunction. In all likelihood, without the necessary changes in the FOXP2 gene, Homo sapiens would have quickly perished, like the other hominin species that once inhabited the planet. But what exactly is the FOXP2 gene? This gene functions as a transcription factor, meaning that it regulates the expression of other genes, particularly those involved in neural development and synaptic plasticity. FOXP2 plays a critical role in the formation and refinement of neural circuits underlying motor control, learning, and, most importantly, vocal learning. It has been extensively studied across species. In birds such as the zebra finch, FOXP2 is active in brain regions associated with song learning, and disruptions to the gene impair the bird's ability to imitate songs, a deficit that closely parallels certain human speech disorders. Notably, all species capable of vocal learning, including bats, whales, and elephants, exhibit specialized FOXP2 activity, suggesting a deeply conserved evolutionary role in the capacity to learn complex vocal patterns. The crucial thing to understand about FOXP2 is that it does not only facilitate the learning of vocal signals, but it does so in a way that enables adaptive flexibility. What suggests to us that FOXP2 was one of the foundational pillars in the emergence of language is the extraordinary degree of biological attention devoted to its tailoring and fine-tuning since the earliest genetic changes appeared in it in human genome. When a gene functions adequately, there is typically no evolutionary pressure to alter it. Mutations are generally neutral or deleterious and get eliminated over generations. In contrast, FOXP2 appears to have been shaped almost entirely by positive selection, meaning that mutations within the gene were consistently retained and reinforced. This is a highly unusual pattern in evolutionary genetics. As neuroendocrinologist Robert Sapolsky notes, 99% of the changes in FOXP2 in humans appeared as a result of mutations. This suggests that they were beneficial, adaptive modifications that were preserved by the species. FOXP2, indeed, proved useful to humans. It was continuously and purposefully modified and refined through the process of natural selection for a reason. The reason, we think, is that it allowed us to create a vast gamma of sound combinations, each pertaining to a sole object or phenomena, and then to be able to flexibly combine these signs into new meanings. Our enormous flexibility in signal creation is unmatched in the animal world. But we must also temper our enthusiasm. In the end, FOXP2 did not grant humans anything fundamentally different from what is found in animals. Rather, it enhanced the capacity to generate multiple signals for communicating a broader and more complex range of emotions. Although the number and subtlety of emotions that could be expressed through specific signals became exceptionally vast, they remained, at their core, emotional in nature. Some of our more attentive listeners may be puzzled by the following apparent contradiction. We state that language developed rapidly, within a relatively small, isolated group of Homo sapiens, over the course of only several generations. Yet, for a stable mutation in the FOXP2 gene to manifest uniformly across the entire group, a much longer timespan would ordinarily be required. How can this apparent paradox be resolved? We propose that the FOXP2 mutation occurred in this group significantly earlier, possibly as a result of dramatic environmental changes that placed increased selective pressure on versatile vocal signaling and auditory discrimination. For example, the aftermath of a volcanic eruption may have filled the atmosphere with dust, reducing visibility for an extended period and thereby diminishing the effectiveness of visual cues. Alternatively, a persistently foggy habitat might have similarly prioritized vocalization and auditory signaling as essential means of social coordination and orientation. In any case, by the time language was called upon as the ultimate remedy for neuronal dysfunction, the FOXP2 mutation had likely already become fixed in all members of the group. It was at the point when the cognitive distortion, caused by regressing mental images, reached a critical threshold, that the invention of language became an evolutionary necessity. As Simon Kirby, a leading researcher in the field of evolutionary linguistics and cultural evolution of language, states, once basic prerequisites for vocal learning and cognitive complexity were in place, cultural evolution could drive the rapid emergence and refinement of language systems within only a few generations. William Tecumseh Fitch, a cognitive biologist and an authority on the biological foundations of language evolution, similarly notes, genetic changes provided the enabling conditions for language, but the emergence of complex language systems was primarily driven by cultural transmission and social selection, which can operate on very short timescales. The outlined scenario for the FOXP2 mutation underscores the point we made earlier. Many complex factors had to converge for the emergence of language. Ultimately, it was, in essence, a fortuitous accident. We have explained the process of language creation within the framework of our theory. Let us briefly summarize the key conclusions of this lecture. 1. As a result of encephalization and the formation of neuronal mirror systems in the brain, early humans began to suffer from a cognitive dysfunction, the spontaneous production of mental images perceived internally. In order to stabilize their perception, they were compelled to find a method for externalizing these superfluous, internal images, placing them, as it were, back into the external world, where perception should originate. 2. The first signs of this condition may have appeared in species predating Homo sapiens, possibly over 1 million years ago. The neurological dysfunction intensified around 100,000 years ago, particularly among Homo sapiens. By 75,000 years ago, many individuals across various populations exhibited signs of severe cognitive disruption. Symbolic artifacts became more common, yet there was still no evidence of language. Despite their symbolic function, artistic practices were ultimately insufficient to stabilize the increasingly unstable perceptual mechanisms. A dramatic population decline ensued, culminating in a genetic bottleneck that drastically reduced the number of surviving Homo sapiens. 3. Around 60 to 50,000 years ago, a small and isolated group of Homo sapiens, likely among the last of their kind, living under specific environmental conditions, in a region somewhere in the southern part of Africa, underwent a critical mutation in the FOXP2 gene. This mutation enabled the invention of language, a versatile and effective strategy for managing the neurological dysfunction caused by self-referential circuits in the brain. The method involved externalizing an emotion related to a mental image through vocalization, then receiving an echo of that vocalization from another individual, allowing the regression to be perceived not as something happening within the person, but as unfolding externally, in what might be called the mind of reality. The external reality thus acquired its own intentionality. My mind begins to exist outside of myself, and the external reality, comprising the other individual who echoes me, becomes me, outside of me. The described early vocal exchanges may be seen as the first proto-conversations, primitive, yet foundational rituals of emotional alignment, whose core social function remains central in human communication to this day. 4. Over time, the intervals between vocalization and echo, the wait for the echo periods, grew longer, allowing the brain to develop tolerance for the absence of immediate vocal response. This strengthened the illusion that symbols exist independently of the self, anchored in material reality, remaining the material self outside the mental self. Yet even in modern humans, if the delay between the utterance and its echo becomes too long, the risk of mental regression, the re-internalization of the torturous chaos of mental imagery, remains real, threatening severe psychological distress and potentially leading to irreparable psychic pathologies. 5. Having invented language, the isolated group of Homo sapiens, endowed with its adaptive genomic profile, rapidly expanded and colonized new regions of the African continent. Their descendants launched the third great exodus out of Africa and instigated what we now call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. 6. Deep caves served as ideal environments for practicing the newly acquired linguistic ability. Echo-rich galleries allowed individuals to relieve themselves of mental images, even in the absence of the others, by vocalizing into the reverberating space. In our next lecture, we will examine in detail the key milestones in human evolution and analyze whether, and in what ways, the new skills, anatomical changes, and behaviors acquired at each stage of these qualitative shifts contributed to the development of language and symbolic thought. We thank you for your attention, and we look forward to continuing this exploration with you. In the following segment, we will present the reference list of the supporting literature used in preparing this lecture.